Torture, the act of intentionally inflicting harm so as to cause intense physical pain. While there are ethical and legal implications associated with modern-day punishment, there was a time when torture was legal. According to Bria Ennis in his book, The History of Torture, the use of torture was a legal means of punishment for at least 3,000 years. And there's archaeological evidence that torture was used in early Neolithic Europe approximately 7,000 years ago. Torture was deemed to be necessary when trying to elicit information about planned actions against the state by known enemies. While there was a system of justice for citizens, slaves and foreigners were subjected to torture.
And you?
I've told you. I've never seen her.
Here we're witnessing a slave being dunked in a tank of water, being forced to hold his breath as part of an interrogation procedure. Other torture methods included branding individuals, creating intense pain.
Leave him. There's no need. Bring him up. Well, boy, where's Eleanor? Let him recover, unless you want to kill him.
The rack. The rack is purported to have first been used in antiquity. Pictured here, the rack was used as a means of interrogation. A person would be placed on their back on this device. Their arms would be bound on the upper end of the rack, and their ankles would be strapped to the lower end. The resulting injuries would be the complete dislocation of all limbs, breaking cartilage, ligaments, and breaking bones. A pretty cruel and unusual punishment. Crucifixion. The term crucifixion was derived from the Latin word crucifixion or crucifixus, which means fixed to a cross. Crucifixion was the practice of nailing a person to a wooden cross, resulting in their slow and agonizing death. Death resulted from hemorrhaging, dehydration, multiple organ failure, or progressive asphyxiation. Because the victim's body weight would pull on the outstretched arms, breathing would become very difficult. This form of capital punishment and torture was invented by the Persians between 300 and 400 BC. The practice involved taking 7-inch nails and driving them through the wrists of the victim and affixing them to a wooden cross. The feet would be nailed to the lower arm of the cross so that the knees were bent at a 45-degree angle. Crucifixion was the preferred method of capital punishment in Rome until Constantine I in the 4th century AD. Crucifixion was primarily used for slaves, criminals, foreigners, and Christians. It was rare for a Roman citizen to die by crucifixion, and the method used ultimately determined the timeliness of their death. When victims were tied by rope to their crucifix, it would take several days for them to die. If the victim was tied with their arms above their head, they would die in 10 to 30 minutes because of the inability to breathe in this position. If the victim was crucified with their arms outstretched, death would occur within 24 hours. Because it was the practice in Rome that soldiers could not leave the site until the victim died, in their haste to leave, they were known to assist in speeding up the process by fracturing the bones in the foot, breaking the large leg bones so the victim couldn't hold up their body weight, taking their spears to stab victims in the chest, or lighting fires at the foot of the crucifix to asphyxiate the victim. It was known that once the large leg bones were broken, all of the victim's weight would shift to their arms, resulting in their arms being pulled from their sockets, and all the body weight shifting to the victim's chest. This would in turn cause the rib cage to lift and create a constant state of inhalation. The most noted crucifixion in the history of the world was the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth between AD 29 and 36. According to biblical scholars, Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours before he was pronounced dead. Scaphism. Possibly one of the most inhumane forms of human torture was the practice of scaphism. Dubbed as an ancient form of torture in ancient Persia, the term scaphism is derived from the Greek term for boat. Scaphism was a torture reserved for serious crimes such as murder. The victim would be forced to drink large amounts of milk and honey and would then be placed inside a wooden boat with another wooden boat used as a lid to create a container. The victim's head and extremities would be positioned in spaces drilled in the lid of the boat and sides, with only those extremities being visible. The victim's body would be covered with additional honey in order to attract vermin and insects. As a result of the force feeding, victims would vomit. The vomitus would then be smeared over the victim in addition to the honey mixture. Also, the forced feeding resulted in a laxative effect, causing the victim to have diarrhea. This excrement would remain in the bow of the boat. The victim would then be placed in shallow water so that pests could access the victim's container. Over the course of the next 2 to 3 days, the victim would literally be eaten alive by rats, bugs, and vultures. As infection set in, insects would eat and breed inside the victim's open flesh wounds. The smell was described as horrible, with victims begging for immediate death. Tar and feathering. The practice of tar and feathering was a centuries-old practice designed to humiliate and punish its victims. The hot mixture of tar combined with the feathers was a very painful practice and resulted in long-term damage to skin and long-term injury. In April of 1919, the University of Maine was the site of a brutal attack on 2 brothers, Samuel and Roger Courtney. At around 2 a.m., approximately 60 white students came to the Courtney brother dorm at Hamlin Hall. The initial attempt to detain the brothers was unsuccessful, and they managed to escape the angry mob. However, the mob almost doubled in size, hunted down the brothers, and led them back to campus with horse halters around their necks. They were held down, stripped, and their heads were shaved. They were forced to put hot molasses all over their skin and then feathers from their dorm room pillows were placed all over their bodies. Sadly, there were no arrests made, and the president of the university at that time, Robert J. Ailey, was quoted as saying, "This was likely to happen any time at any college, the gravity depending much upon the susceptibilities of the victim and the notoriety given it." It was noted that no formal university investigation occurred, but the president made a note to let the reporters know that one of the Courtney brothers had violated an unspecified university policy, almost as a defense to the humiliating cruelty. Courtney brothers never completed their studies, and by 1930, both brothers had died. The Brazen Bull.
The brazen bull was a torture device used in ancient Greece. It was made of bronze and shaped like a bull. The victim would be placed inside the bull and a fire would be lit underneath it. The victim would then slowly roast to death. The brazen bull was invented by Perillos of Athens in the 6th century BC. It was used as a method of execution by the Roman Emperor Claudius in the 1st century AD. 1. The Iron Maiden. Device. The Iron Maiden was a torture device that was used during the medieval period. It was a large metal frame that had spikes on the inside. The victim would be placed inside the frame and the spikes would pierce their skin. The Iron Maiden was often used as a form of public torture, as it was a very slow and painful way to die. There are many different accounts of the Iron Maiden, as it was a popular torture device during the medieval period. One account describes the Iron Maiden as being used to torture a woman who had been accused of being a witch. The woman was placed inside the Iron Maiden and the spikes pierced her skin. She was left to die a slow and painful death. Another account describes the Iron Maiden as being used to torture a man who had been accused of stealing from the king. The man was placed inside the Iron Maiden and the spikes pierced his skin. He was left to die a slow and painful death. The Iron Maiden was a torture device that was used to inflict a slow and painful death. It was often used as a form of public torture, as it was a very effective way to scare people. The Iron Maiden was a popular torture device during the medieval period, and there are many different accounts of its use. The Spanish donkey torture is one of the most cruel and sadistic forms of torture ever devised. It was used extensively during the Spanish Inquisition and other times of religious persecution. The victim was tied to a donkey with their hands and feet bound. The donkey would then be slowly dragged along a rough path, often for miles. The victim would be forced to watch as their own body was slowly ripped apart by the donkey's hooves. The torture was so excruciating that it was often fatal. The Spanish donkey torture was a truly horrific way to die.
Flaying. Aztecs used this method of torture to remove the skin of victims. The goal was to keep the skin intact so that it could be displayed as a warning to others. Now I think we know where the term fillet comes from. According to Catholic and Orthodox tradition, Saint Bartholomew was flayed, and that's F-L-A-Y-E-D, before being crucified in the United States. Nat Turner, who led a rebellion against slavery in Virginia, was hanged in 1831, and according to author John Cromwell, his body was then flayed, and his skin was used to make purses and sold as souvenirs. Sawing. The Emperor Caligula liked to use the method sawing as his favorite form of punishment and torture. In this method, the victim is suspended upside down, and a large saw blade is used to cut the victim in half. It was torturous in that the saw would start at the groin area and proceed to the head until the victim was cut in half. It was said because the victim was hung upside down, the amount of blood in the brain allowed the victim to remain alive until the saw blade reached the main blood vessels in the stomach.